So, little backstory. In 2003, I was a 16-year-old employee at an urban clothing store here on the south side of Chicago. At the time, I had a manager who was in his early 20s by the name of Anthony. Anthony was pretty arrogant and obnoxious, but overall he was a pretty cool guy. I used to kind of give him shit and tease him when it came to approaching the ladies, because he always seemed timid or too aggressive. I was and still am a ladies' man, so yeah, I was being an asshole. After working at this place for about 3 months, Anthony asks me if I would drop him off at home. It wasn't far from the direction I was headed in, so I dropped him off maybe twice a week for the next month or so. Now let me tell you, these car rides were uncomfortable. This guy, as much as we spoke at work, would not speak and sort of just kept looking straight. It got to the point that this awkwardness went from entertaining. I was 16, most awkward people are interesting to teenagers, to straight creepy. Fast forward, 3 to 4 years later, I'm watching the news as they go into detail of a horrific crime committed by a Comcast installation worker. Apparently, the Comcast worker entered 2 homes he was due for an installation, raped, beat, and strangled 2 women. The real unfortunate thing is this happened on 2 different occasions, and after the first murder, the gentleman was arrested and questioned, but released and sent back to work, which allowed him to strike again. As the picture of his mugshot flashed on the screen, I froze. It was Anthony. Now, growing up on the south side of Chicago, I have grown up and befriended a fair share of people who grew up to be murderers. But this took the cake. So, Anthony Triplet, let's not meet, because that means I'm in jail with you. My friends and I back in college would not necessarily call ourselves ghost hunters, but we like to go out into the woods at night and find old abandoned houses, graveyards and the like, which are plentiful when you live in the middle of nowhere. A common place for us to go was a park which is very far into the woods and had an old covered bridge that was supposedly haunted. As an explanation as to why this bridge seems so scary, there is a light at the end of the bridge, and the shadows of the trees form what looks like a figure. When you sit in the middle of the bridge, the wind makes the figure look like it is moving towards you. To the unsuspecting visitor, this can be a frightening experience. So we like to take our friends here to freak them out. To set the scene, it was late summer on a Wednesday night, probably around 2 a.m. We were all on summer break and had nothing going on, so we decided to take a couple people down to the bridge to give them a good scare. This area is not easy to get to. There are a lot of steep hills and rocky roads. It is very secluded. So, as expected, there were no other cars on the road. We got down to the bridge as we had so many other times before. It was tough to see the light at the end, but there were definitely plenty of shadows around, so the scare factor was still pretty high. So, as you're supposed to, we parked our car in the middle of the covered bridge and turned our lights off as well as our engine. Immediately, the people we brought with us saw the shadow figure approaching our car. We obviously tried to play it up and act like we saw it coming towards us as well, to continue to scare them. But something was wrong this time. The figure seemed a lot more lifelike, not like a tree swaying in the wind. It didn't feel like an illusion at all. I looked over at my friends and could tell they noticed something was different this time too. It was at that point that I noticed we were no longer looking at the same shadow figure at the end of the bridge. This one actually moved directly in front of our car. In a panic, I turned on the headlights because it was becoming a bit too real. Once the lights came on, the figure did not disappear and it did not stop inching toward our car. There in front of our car was a person in an all-black hoodie and black pants, hoodie over his head, looking down at the ground. After the lights came on, he kept inching toward the car at a snail's pace. A prank, I thought. Someone saw us come down and was familiar with the story and wanted to mess with us. We opened our windows and yells, "Hey, you got us, that's pretty good." He had no reaction. Thinking he was just trying to stay in character, we laughed it off and backed out of the bridge and started heading back up the hill. There was a parking lot up at the top of the hill, still pretty deep into the woods, maybe a minute or two drive from the bridge. We decided to head up that way to gather our thoughts and sort of process everything that had just happened, since adrenaline was still running pretty high. We got to the parking lot, which is normally about a quarter full on a busy weekend during midday with hikers, as it's a pretty popular hiking spot in the area. But 2 a.m. on a Wednesday should have this lot totally empty. Upon pulling in, every spot was full. Considering the park closed at dusk, this was a disturbing discovery. We parked in the middle of the lot, trying to figure out what was going on. I grew up just minutes from this area, and the amount of cars in the lot was probably the equivalent of the nearest town's entire population. We sat in the lot for about 5 to 10 minutes, just talking to each other, trying to figure out what was going on, when 2 German shepherds came running down the hill. They stopped at our car briefly, and then continued running off into the woods. The girl that we had brought with us had a look of horror on her face and told us that we needed to leave. Confused and still a bit concerned, I agreed and left the area quickly. She put everything together. She said that cult activity in the area around us was very high. German shepherds are commonly an animal they use for sacrifices. I do not know where she got this information, but all I know is that it's been about 5 years. I never saw her again, and I never went back to that bridge at night again. In the summer of 2004, I was on my first break from college. I had just completed my freshman year and I, at the time 19, female, was missing being away from my new college friends. One Saturday night in July, my college friend, Julianne, from out of town was having a birthday party. She wanted to invite lots of friends to a hotel room for drinking and hanging out. I was kind of a late bloomer and really just started driving my freshman year of college. Back then, I was naive and apparently had a look of friendliness and helplessness, as I always tended to have strangers trying to talk to me, or come to my aid when I really didn't need anything. I was excited to be going to this motel room party. I arrived in the late evening. It was a Motel 6 outside of downtown, near an area that used to be a shopping mall, but it just started its descent as a new mall was being put in the other side of town. I'm thinking she chose that mall due to the price because it wasn't near our college or near anything that you would want to be near, unless she planned on doing some shopping the next day. There weren't that many cars at the motel. I got out and went up to the second floor where her room was located, at the corner, near the entrance to the parking lot from the front road. There weren't many people in the room, and it was a typical motel room with 2 queen-sized beds, a bathroom, and a TV. I remember taking a beer and having a few sips. I was feeling slightly uncomfortable. That was mostly because the usual college pals weren't there, and we weren't doing our usual thing. Normally, my boyfriend and his roommate would be hanging out, and we'd watch a weird movie and have an interesting conversation. This time it was just people talking and drinking. Kind of boring for my tastes. Plus, I'm a pretty major introvert. I was kind of looking for an out. And when there was a lull in conversation, I told Julianne and her boyfriend John that I had to go. They walked me to the door and we said a few goodbyes while we stood on the balcony overlooking the parking lot. While we were talking, a taxi cab pulled up to the motel right under the balcony where we were standing. I looked down as a man got out of the back of the cab. The alarming thing was that as soon as he got out, he stood and looked straight up at me, staring. He had no expression on his face, nor did he make a move to go where he was headed or even to pay the cab driver. The cab took off and he just stood there staring at me. He began to smile in a very creepy way, like he knew he was scaring me and he enjoyed it. But at the same time, it was like there was no one home in his eyes. He looked at me as if I was the only one there, and as if he expected me. Like in some parallel universe he was supposed to find me. Like this was his whole night's purpose. It was unnerving. But then he walked off. We just kind of joked about it, and then I went down to get into my car. I unlocked my door, put my purse in the passenger seat, and just as I did that, a car pulled up right behind my car as if to block my exit. I looked over, and it was that man who got out of the cab. He apparently had a car, and as soon as he left from staring at me, he got in and followed me to where my car was. He just parked there and was staring at me with the same creepy smile on his face, but with no other indication of any self-awareness. The only thing I could think to do was run back up to the party. Unfortunately, I left my purse in the passenger seat and left my door unlocked because I was so freaked out that I just wanted to get as far away from this man as possible. I knocked on the door and told my friend and her boyfriend. John came out to the balcony with me, and the car was still there. We called the motel lobby and asked for them to send the security guard to escort me to my car. The guard came by, an overweight fellow who looked really unhappy to be there. He just knocked on the motel door and didn't even walk me down. He barely even said anything. He just stood on the balcony looking down. I got tired of the situation, and since the creeper's car was gone, I decided to just race down and get in my car and leave. John walked me to my car though, since the security guard was being a weirdo. I got in, started it, and zoomed out of there as fast as I could before that man showed up again. I did pause in my car to make sure John got back to the room safely before taking off on the front road. But my doors were locked, and I was ready for imminent exit. This might not seem like much, but the way the man just got out of the cab and looked up at me really freaked me out. It was as if he was coming to the hotel just for me. He wouldn't have been able to see me from his seated position in the cab, which made it even weirder when the first thing he did was turn his head up to see me and stare. He didn't seem to have a room, and I wondered afterwards if he had a car that he used to block me in, why he needed a cab at all. My purse was still in my car and nothing removed from it, so I don't think he was there to rob me. That's what's really scary, that and the fact that he acted like my friends weren't even there. For weeks later I was shaken by what could have happened if I didn't leave my blocked-in car as soon as possible, and I began to imagine scenarios where he came up to the window. The only imagined scenario that made me feel any safer was if I acted insane. I imagined getting out a knife, but that didn't help. Not until I imagined laughing maniacally or barking did I feel like he may have backed off. To this day I carry a knife in the car just in case, but I feel like that may not be the best protection. This story took place no more than 3 years ago. For a little background, I was with my then boyfriend from the UK, as he had come to visit me and meet my family in beautiful Colombia. We haven't seen each other for a while, so I decided to buy a couple of plane tickets and take him from one plane to another at the very next day of his arrival. I did a lot of research, since I wanted to show him a place that not even I knew, and that we could both explore together. I chose this set of islands near the northwest of the country and at least 10 hours away from my hometown. The plan was to get off the plane, take a cab to a small coastal town, and from there take a boat to the chosen island. We made it to the small regional airport on time, took our bags, and started asking around where we could take the cab that will take us to our next stop. We found a cab service that took us along with other people in a van, and after a couple of hours, made it to the small fishing town. After getting off the van, we noticed that the sun was setting, and no boat will take us to the island at that time. So we decided to find a cheap hotel and sleep for the night. After walking around asking in different hotels, we chose the cheapest one. It was a little gross, but we didn't care. We were all about the island that waited ahead. On the next day, after a delicious yet humble breakfast, we took our bags to the port, found a boat, and it took us to the little island we wanted to go to. Our time in the island was lovely. We were almost alone, and stayed at an eco-friendly hostel that took our breath away. The white sand beaches were clean since no more than 50 tourists were at the island at the time, and most of them locked inside a 5-star hotel that we found walking down the shore. After 5 magical days on this beautiful paradise, we were heading back. Money was running low now, and since I was the one paying for almost everything on this trip, I was struggling to keep up. We made it back to the fishing town somehow, and we still have yet one more day left. We searched again for a nicer hotel this time, somewhere we could actually shower and relax, and then got bored indoors. It was just too hot to stay inside, so we decided to go explore. This town was small in comparison with other Colombian cities or towns, but at the same time quite overpopulated. More than 2,000 people lived there, and even though they all knew each other, it still felt a little crowded. The beaches in this town were not as nice as the islands, especially because the sand was dark. Ocean had brown and green-colored waters, and it was dirty. Since the amount of tourists from the other small town nearby was at an all-time rise. We did not want to bathe in those waters, and started asking around where we could go for a nicer beach nearby. Many people agreed that there was this beach called La Playa del Francés, translated as something like the French guy's beach. And apparently it was cleaner, solitary, and romantic. We did not need to hear any more. We took a simple bag with our phones, sunblock, water, towel, wallets with money, and a hotel key. I was wearing this bag as a crossbody since it was an ethnic kind of bag we use in Colombia called mochila. And it's basically one big ball of fabric with a strap sewn or cut on opposite sides. It has no way to close up, so imagine you are wearing a grocery bag, but the straps are just one, and it's way longer. We started walking. The sun was scorching, and the sand felt like burning even through our flip-flops. I must admit I was excited about exploring, but at the time many people warned us to be careful. That there were a lot of alleged robberies in the area, but this is an everyday thing in my country, so I didn't pay no mind. Every time I saw a guy or a group of guys, my heart would flutter. It felt like having tiny little panic attacks every time you see a face coming out of the dirt roads. This was a very poor town, so I wasn't concerned about how the people looked raggedy and dirty. However, my heart fluttered here and there when I saw people, especially once the tourist area started fading out in the background, and we just kept walking towards the port and the more empty beaches. We noticed the sand getting cleaner, less trash, and also less people. Every time less. We saw this group of guys talking, and they stopped as they saw us and stared. I tried to remain calm and try to look like I wasn't out of my mind, and asked with my strongest voice, "Excuse me, do you know how far is the French guy's beach from here?" One of them scoffed and replied, "You are a ways far. Maybe you should take a cab or a motorcycle." We did not want to spend yet more money on unnecessary expenses. I had already started using my cards since I was out of cash, so I just looked at him and said, "Okay, thanks. We'll keep walking and see what happens." We uncomfortably waved and kept walking. We noticed that as soon as we left, they did also, and were talking between themselves, but it wasn't possible to hear what they were saying as they were walking on the opposite direction. We kept walking through the beach. We saw the port coming up to us, and the beach in that area was closed. We were forced to take one of those dirt roads parallel to the beach and into the neighborhoods. What we didn't know is that we were walking right into the slums. My boyfriend back then was a very cheap guy. I'm not saying everyone from the UK is, but this particular guy was. So we started fighting once I figured we were really far, but he didn't want to chip in for a cab ride. I got really upset and said, "You know what, screw it. I have covered for everything on this trip, and I'm fed with it. We are heading back." He started arguing something like, "I already spent my money as well," to which I interrupted with another snappy comment, and so on and so forth. The fight got a little heated from then on, partially because of the intense heat, and partially because my feet hurt since it was so hot, and I started walking in front of him, getting further and further away from him. As we fought, we headed back toward the beach where we had come from, and just before we reached it, I saw this young, scrawny guy standing next to a bush, right in the corner where we had to turn. I paid no mind since I was so upset and focused on fighting with my cheap-ass boyfriend. When we started getting closer, I noticed the guy was staring at us, and I just thought it was because we looked exotic. A very white, blue-eyed foreigner, and the dark-skinned Colombian with the long hair. I made it to the corner first, and I was about to mutter a weak "Good afternoon," since it's a common courtesy in our land to do so. But the words died in my mouth as the guy quickly stood forward and jumped me. The movements were fast, and I only saw glimpses of what was happening. There was another guy hidden behind the first one, and he also came forward, but this one went straight to my very scared and frozen in fear boyfriend. The first guy tried to grab my bag as he pulled this huge knife from behind his back. It was a long and wide silver blade, and it shone against the burning sunlight. He kept saying something like, "Fucking gringos, give me the bag." By this time, I fell on the ground. The blow didn't do anything to me though. I was too concerned about keeping my hands around my bag, holding it tight to my chest. That bag held inside my brand new iPhone, the same I just started paying for. Thoughts raced through my head. What was my boyfriend doing? The guy kept trying to pull the bag from underneath me as I cried, "No, please, no!" And he said, "Let go or I'll cut you, bitch." I was rolling on the ground, hugging the bag, as I saw the shine of the knife again, but this time it went under me as he cut the strap and held the bag as well. He yanked the bag and I stood up as soon as I could, just to see him getting on a bicycle, as the other guy was just blocking my ex. This made me hate him at this point. The stupid idiot was just held behind the other guy without even touching him. He was blocking him by just standing there, and my idiot ex just stood there as if he was being held captive by some invisible box. The second guy turned around to see his friend getting on his bike, and rushed to do the same on another bike parked behind the bush, where they had been hiding. I did not hesitate. Somehow, I wanted to fight for that phone. It's hard to obtain such expensive items in Colombia, and I've worked really hard for the past couple of years to get a brand new one. I was powered by pure hatred. I hated them. I hated the country. I hated the government. I hated the fact that society's conditions have created such violence, such poverty and deprivation. I felt sick of it all. I wanted to bash their heads in. I wanted to be violent as well. They quickly took off on their bikes, and I quickly took off running behind them. My flip-flops flew in the air as my first few steps hit the scorching hot dirt road, and the tiny rocks cut and hurt the skin on them. I was fueled by hatred then, and I ran like I have never run before. At the same time I was screaming, there were people just standing on their precarious house doors. Some of them even came outside as they heard the commotion. I was screaming, "Stop them! They just robbed us! Help! Help!" I never thought I would say such a silly word. Believe me, in Colombia, people prefer to be robbed and head home feeling defeated afterwards. Hell, I've done it as well, many times in the past. See my story called The Woodsman, to see how much of a wimp I was back then. This time, I was determined. I was tired of being a pushover for lousy crooks that were half my age. I would give it my all, just as I had grabbed that bag like I was grabbing the edge of a cliff. I ran like I was being chased by Jason Voorhees. I ran and screamed for 2 blocks, and many people started screaming as well and pointing at them. But no one did nothing, and soon enough, they started gaining terrain in front of me. They then turned around one of the corners down the road. I kept running as I saw them turn yet again on another corner. By then they were too far, and I couldn't follow anymore. I was heartbroken. I stopped running, and I threw myself on the ground and started pounding on the dirt road, crying, screaming hysterically. I couldn't believe they robbed me so easily, in such a stupid way. How could I explain this to my parents? How would I even call them? People started walking towards and surrounding me. My idiot ex-boyfriend arrived a few seconds later, jogging slowly, trying to comfort me, but I just wasn't having it. I cried as people asked me, "What did they take? What did you have in your bag?" Between tears I cried, "Our phones and wallets." But at this point I realized phone robbery is so common it wouldn't matter at all. So I decided to lie. "And our passports? He's from England. And now how is he gonna go back?" They all started murmuring, while a huge, luxurious truck appeared at the end of the road. A very heavy woman yelled right away, "They took their passports! There's the mayor! There's the mayor!" Some other lady asked, "Anyone know who it was?" Then I heard another voice saying, "It was Ms. Rosario's son. I saw him." The sounds were now getting confusing. There were at least 20 people around me trying to comfort me and asking questions. The truck slowly rolled closer, and the heavy lady pretty much jumped in front of it. She was screaming too. "They took their passports. That's why we can't get enough tourists here from other places." And more people started complaining to the mayor. I slowly stood up and looked at the man behind the wheel. He was a very heavy fellow, shaved head, no facial hair, and with a stern look on his face, he said nothing. There was a guy next to him. He seemed to be his secretary, as he did all the talking. He asked where we were staying at, what they took, and who it was. I told him I didn't know who they were, but the heavy lady interrupted me and repeated, "It's Mr. Rosario's son. It's Ms. Rosario's son. The ones from the slums." The mayor remained quiet and just staring. The secretary then said to a couple of guys standing in the back, "Take them back to their hotel," and then looked at me. "We will let you know if we find anything." After that, they left. The 2 other guys took us back to the hotel on the back of their dirt bikes. I felt defeated and weak. When we got back to the hotel, we explained on the front desk what had happened and the reason we didn't have our key anymore. The owner, an elderly gentleman, walked us back, muttering encouraging words, and opened the room for us. I threw myself on the bed and cried. My feet were bleeding, and my head felt like exploding. My idiot ex tried to console me, but I just scoffed and told him to let me be. I had to make phone calls now, cancel my cards, my national ID document, all of that complicated stuff. A few hours passed, I calmed down, took a shower, and started thinking what I was going to do next. Then I heard a dirt bike, and after that a call to our room. The front desk gentleman told us there was someone looking for the gringo couple, so we went outside. It was the heavy lady, riding a beat-up dirt bike, and boy was she upset. She kept saying that she hated when things like this happen, and that the mayor needs to step up and make the town safe for tourists. Because that was their whole income right there, selling snacks, knickknacks or beer to the tourists on the beach. She then saw the mayor's truck coming down the road and told me, "When he comes closer, we'll demand that he does something or I'll do it myself." The truck came closer, and once again, when the window rolled down, I saw the stern look on that dark face again. He said nothing, but the secretary did. "We found a bag, but it didn't have any passports in it." And then he pulled up my mangled bag. Strap cut, but it didn't excite me. I muttered something like, "Oh yeah, we checked, and the passports were actually in the room, thank God." He gave me a weird look and said, "This is all we could recover. Sorry about that, but people should really have warned you before you entered the slums." I merely took the bag and felt the weight way lighter. I was not optimistic at this point. I muttered a quick thanks as the heavy lady kept talking about how this could never happen again. This is their town, and they need the tourists to come visit and blah blah blah. I just held the bag in my stomach, as if its warmth would make stop feeling that emptiness inside. But it didn't. I then started walking towards the room again. I opened the bag just to make sure what they have left in it, and oh surprise, cherubs sang as I saw, at the bottom of it, my phone. With no case, just the plain phone, my cards and documents. No wallet, of course. And the room key. I felt like screaming. I took it out, and it was on plane mode, which made me assume they'd try to unlock it and couldn't since it had a passcode. I couldn't believe my luck. Up until this day, I still don't believe I got it back. It's so unlikely. It's like finding a green sapphire. The gentleman on the front desk came towards me and said, "They were probably looking at your every move ever since you made it back from the islands. They knew where you were and when. Be careful in the future, would you, sweetheart?" To what I only replied with an automated, "Yes, sir, will do." I can't believe my screaming, crying, lying, and hysteria had worked on my advantage. My then boyfriend and I left on the next morning, counting our blessings, and headed back to my hometown. We didn't last long after that trip, though. He just wasn't strong enough for me. I was already feeling invincible. I was a badass, and I wasn't going to be scared ever again. I'd actually kind of forgotten about this until recently, when my memory was jogged by seeing a few other stalker-type stories on here. I downplayed it at the time, which seems disturbingly common. And it's only now, in hindsight, that I realize how skeevy the whole situation actually was. This gets pretty wordy, but bear with me. So this was some years back, when I was only 16. For reference, I'm a girl. My family had recently moved cities, so it was a whole new neighborhood, new school, new friends, all that good stuff that comes with a more major move. I had to get used to not being able to walk to school too. I had to take the bus downtown, and then walk from there to get to where my school was, which was a first for me, since all my previous schools had been within walking distance. Now, the bus system itself wasn't a problem at all. What became a problem was that apparently someone started watching me at the bus stop. About 3 months or something after the move, I created a Facebook profile for the sake of some competition or other, you know, like this Facebook page for a chance of winning this and that. I had nothing else on this profile at all beyond my name. This was before it was borderline mandatory to be active on Facebook. No picture, no information, hadn't even added any friends. It was blank save for that 1 or 2 liked pages. I halfway forgot I'd even made the damn profile. But then, after a few days, I got an email alert for a message on Facebook. So I went to see what was up. It was from an account that was just as empty as mine, and it simply said, "You're cute." What? I was and still am pretty cute, but nothing out of the ordinary. What puzzled me the most was obviously how whoever this person was would know that, because no, I didn't recognize the profile name at all. And of course my profile didn't even have a picture. I replied something like, "Huh, thanks, but how would you even know?" I wasn't really seeing a red flag yet. I was a little curious, a little flattered. I was still a bit naive, I suppose. So I got back. "I've seen you at the bus stop, and that didn't sit quite right with me. Obviously. At the same time, though, I was telling myself it wasn't really a big deal, and I didn't feel too worried or anything. This was a very nice neighborhood, and I'll mention that I'm from Sweden, which is generally safe. Still, that didn't explain how he'd know my name, which is what I asked him next, how he recognized me. He said he wouldn't tell me unless I added him on MSN, the chat client predominantly used at the time, and talked to him on there. After a little back and forth, I gave in and added him on there, primarily because I wanted to know how he'd gotten my name at all. It's not a common name, and I was feeling pretty antsy about that. Part of the reason we'd moved was to get away from a few people. I felt that I had to know how he'd found me, so I'd know in case any other people did. His text language was pretty flirty and all. He threw in lots of winked smileys, but from the way he typed, I got the impression that he was around my age. He had a year in his username that I assumed was his birth year, and if that was true, he'd actually be a year younger than me. So I still didn't feel too worried. But I got pretty uncomfortable when he told me how he'd worked out what my name was. It was from the school yearbook, which doesn't seem that much of a stretch at first. I know, but the thing is that in this city I'd moved to, What they do is that they compile all the schools of the same education level in the city in the same book. So we're talking about 15 schools in that book, and a few hundred pages of photographs. And he'd gone through all of them to find my face and name. I actually checked when he told me this. I wasn't in any obvious place in this book at all. I had no particular spot dedicated to me or an activity I was in. It was just this group photo of my class, about 25 students. I think about 2/3 through the book. Plus, if he really was a year younger than me, he himself wouldn't be in that yearbook, or have ready access to it, because he'd be in a different level of education. To any fellow Swedes, I was in my first year of gymnasiet at the time, so he'd have been in högstadiet. This didn't cross my mind at the time, but again, if he was a year younger than me, what? He'd either had to have looked through his yearbook first, then moved on to a yearbook that wasn't for him. Or he'd seen me at school too, and known to look at the right one for that reason. I didn't really tell him it creeped me out, but he'd start chatting to me on occasion from then on, about mostly normal or inane stuff. So that was fine, I guess. Always with this flirty tone, though. I replied neutrally, or sometimes played along, trying to get an idea of who he was. He said he was a neighbor, and that's when he'd see me at the bus stop. But he'd never told me what he looked like, and when I was at the bus stop, nobody ever came forward as him, or signaled in any way that they might be. Like I said, I didn't recognize his name, if it was even real. He definitely wasn't from our apartment building, though, and for some reason I didn't quite believe him when he said he was from the neighborhood. So I started to feel pretty uneasy at the bus stop, when there were other people there with me, wondering if one of them was him, if he was watching me. But waiting alone at the bus stop didn't really help either, because I started wondering if he was watching me from somewhere else. The stop was situated near a grocery store with a parking lot, so he could have been. I'm pretty sure he did tell me, "You look cute today," or something similar at least once or twice. But I honestly don't remember much of what we talked about anymore when we did chat. I remember they were never very long sessions though. Only 10 minutes to half an hour or so. And I started not really liking seeing him sign on, but for some reason didn't block him. Probably because I still felt I had to work out who he was, and because, well, I didn't feel threatened by him, just uncomfortable. You know, just. Until at some point when he told me, "I found a picture where you live," acting as if that wasn't creepy at all. That skeeved me the fuck out. I asked him where he thought I lived, which was maybe a stupid move, but yeah, he gave me the right number, and the right floor, and the right apartment. And at that point, I was definitely feeling less uncomfortable and more scared. He went on to say that he worked this out because a friend of his had lived in our apartment prior to us, and that the timeline for me appearing and his friend moving out made sense. I didn't believe this at all. In that case, he'd have worked out where I lived a lot sooner, and if he had, why was he only telling me this now? To fuck with me? But if he hadn't found out that way, then what? Had he followed me or something? From the bus stop? I don't remember what I told him, but that scared me big time. A day or so after that, he sent me a message that was something like, "Maybe I'll come over and say hi." And I don't remember the exact wording, but it actually read very threatening to me. It read differently than the other fairly normal stuff we talked about before. And I had such a spike of fear when I got that message. It didn't matter finding out who he was. I didn't want him to come over at all. I remember looking out my bedroom window and being relieved there was nobody outside. And I sent him a message back that I don't want him to come over, ever. He sort of threatened that he would, and then he signed off. I blocked his email and his empty goddamn Facebook profile. And then after I'd done that, I was left feeling really anxious and frightened. Thinking that maybe now he'd come over anyway, once he'd realized I'd cut off all his other options. That maybe he was on his way right now. And then what would he do? I didn't really fear for rape or murder. It was a little too abstract to me at the time. But I was still really scared. And for a while after that, I was scared at the bus stop too. I was scared walking home from it, in particular after school. But nothing happened after I'd blocked him. It all just kind of ended there, which, in hindsight, I consider myself extremely lucky. I was definitely dumb and naive at the time because I didn't mention any of this to my mom or stepdad. And if whoever this guy was hadn't been willing to give up on me or lost interest or whatever happened with him, things could have gotten really, really ugly. I was always waiting at the bus stop myself, and I was often home alone if I'd had a shorter school day. And he did know my name, and where I lived, and I'll say it again, I was only 16. It's possible it was just some socially stupid kid with a distance crush and not knowing how to handle it. But thinking back on it, it seems like it had to be more than that. Either way, I'm glad I never actually met him.
This happened 2 nights ago, so I'm still replaying it over and over in my head. I thought this would be a good place to share. I'm a pretty predictable person with a predictable schedule, so I'm not sure if this was a random occurrence or if someone knew my nightly routine. I'm a 35-year-old woman. My husband Rob gets up for work hours before me, so he goes to bed before I do. I usually get to bed a few hours after he does, around the same time every night. I turn off the lights and the TV in the living room and take my dog to the back door to let her out. The door leads to a large deck outside. Off to the right of the deck is a few steps down and a small path to a gate, which we always keep chained and locked. Every single night before opening the door, I peek out of the window right next to it without disturbing the blinds and flip on the deck light. I never expect anyone to be there, and we've never had a problem with anyone trespassing or trying to break in. It's just something I do every night. Kinda like peeking behind the shower curtain before I pee. I know no one is back there, but if I don't check, then that's gonna be the one time that there's actually someone hiding there, you know? Hey, I watch a ton of horror movies, and it's pitch black outside at night where I live. So a few nights ago, I got ready for bed, went to the back door with my dog slowly following behind me, and peeked out the window. I flipped on the light. My heart jumped into my throat when I saw a skinny, dirty guy in his 30s or 40s standing off to the side of the door, facing it. I see him raise his arm up and hold a screwdriver above his head as soon as a light went on, preparing for someone to open the door. I screamed, "Rob, get up! Get the gun!" as loud as I could, which startled the guy, and he jumped over the rail of the deck and ran. My husband ran out of our bedroom with his gun. He called the police, and they showed up within 5 minutes. They drove around trying to find the guy, but no luck. The guy broke the lock on our gate to get in. He also pried open the back screen door, which we always kept locked as well. If I would have opened that door without looking out first, I might be dead. I don't know if I caught that guy trying to break in, or if he was waiting for me to open the door like I do every night. Either way, it was fucking terrifying. My parents are buying us outdoor security cameras this week as an early birthday present for Rob.